We have Sarah Cook from Freedom House and Isaac Stone Fish from Asia Society. Isaac is working on a book on the topic of our discussion today, which is China's information campaigns in democracies specifically. But obviously, China's information campaigns are all over the world. So that'll be a very big book. Also, a couple of promotional things. I have to brag about this little piece that I wrote. So to show you that I'm a legit Asia specialist, this just came out about 2 hours ago in The Hill, and I'm called an opinion contributor because they're free opinions, and it's about what I can contribute. And this is a story of looking back on my career over the past 25 years and looking back on how American foreign policy is made and why Americans should come together and stop beating each other over the head on Twitter and on social media and in various forums, and just remember that we're fellow Americans and we have shared interests and shared values. And I think that the challenge of China's presenting an alternate system to the United States makes that coming together, that bipartisanship, that comedy, that unity, comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, not a D, although I do love comedy, makes those sort of virtues more important and more urgent than ever. And when researching this piece, I came across this very interesting group called the Committee on the Present Danger. Who knows that committee? Okay. I'd say about 5% of the audience knows that committee. We're about 5%. Okay. Go home and, well, first of all, just read my article because it's a nice summary of this committee. They started in 1950 with Paul Nitze. Everybody know who Paul Nitze is? That's another about 5%. And essentially created the strategy to defeat communism in 1950. And President Truman was persuaded by the onset of the Korean War. So here we are 70 years later, returning to basically the same themes of, instability, uncertainty on the Korean Peninsula, and the return of the Committee on the Present Danger, which reassembled itself recently about a month ago in Washington, D.C., headed by Steve Bannon. Anyone heard of Steve Bannon? Okay, that's about half the audience. Okay, we're getting warmer. We're getting warmer. And their basic modus operandi, their approach is to identify a global threat to American values, American democracy, and then essentially recommend that America dramatically increase its military presence. And that's essentially their calculus. So they did it in the 50s, and then in the 70s with Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld, which they created the so-called Team B exercise to go against the national intelligence estimate on the Soviets. Who knows Paul Wolfowitz? And Rumsfeld? Okay, there we go. So now you see it's relevant. And then they also, after the 9/11 attacks, they recommended the global war on terror, global, GWAT as it's known. And now they've reassembled, and the new threat is the Committee on the Present Danger, China. So they love fighting communists. They're going back to their roots. They're going back to their old jams, And the problem is that they, Steve Bannon and Newt Gingrich, at the opening of this, they said, we have to go after American elites like McKinsey and Booz Allen Hamilton and Goldman Sachs and other elites who are too soft on China. And I think we should really caution against going after our fellow Americans. If you just want to do business with China, that should be allowed, and that we shouldn't engage in a sort of purge mentality in the United States. So again, maybe it's unrealistic to think that we could come together as a country, but I continue to dream, It's a big dream. So today, also, I'd like to thank Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, TECO, for partnering with us on this event. I think last time we had this event, there was some support from Taiwan about a year ago on a similar event that we held. And I just wanted to say, if you don't know why Taiwan would be interested in supporting an event like this, then I don't know why you're here, but if you need to know why, you know, it's really, Taiwan is a fellow democracy that is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, recipient of Chinese influence campaigns. So they have a lot of interest and they have a lot of experience with the topics that we have today, and they, like Carnegie Council, they want to educate the public, and they want to support our efforts to educate the public on how to spot influence campaigns and what to, you know, what they look like, and maybe how to respond appropriately. I think, you know, let me just tell you a quick story. I guess we're still ahead of schedule, so if you don't mind. You're supposed to tell stories, apparently, to be a good moderator. So 10 years ago, do you remember about 10 years ago, the idea on US-China relations was we just keep engaging with them, and eventually the Chinese will come to their senses, and they'll kind of adopt American-type institutions. You know, they'll come around, and that will sort of percolate and infiltrate their thinking, and make them want to adopt free market capitalism and democratic liberal institutions eventually. And to that end, at Carnegie Council 10 years ago, we were doing a bilateral Beijing-New York. Do you remember this? Track 2 dialogue on fighting climate change together. You know, and it was right around the Olympics, so I got to go see the Beijing Olympics, all the infrastructure, and it was very exciting. And it was kind of optimistic at that time that maybe still China and the United States might kind of merge together in systems. And now that type of thinking seems so kind of alien and out of date. Today, what do we have? Today we have the 2020 presidential candidates fighting for who can be toughest on China, right? Trump is saying, you know, he's kind of mocking other candidates, that guy can't be tough enough, and, you know, I can't wait for that guy to you know, mostly guys, some women too. And that's one point. And then second, we have now, according to the press, a full-on trade war with China, very antagonistic. And the media is now, the American media is now calling it a new Cold War, which I thought was kind of like a wonky thing that people said in think tanks. But now even I think the New York Times uses that expression. I don't think that's a precise way of describing the relationship, but that's what the sort of public discourse is like. And Xi Jinping recently said to the Chinese people to prepare for a new long march. And the thinking, at least in American media, because Americans love to think everything is about us, right? So we assume that Xi Jinping was saying this because, oh, it's just because America is going to do a big trade war, is doing a big trade war, so it's our fault, right? So it always comes back to us, right? So with that, the rationale for this conference is really looking at what some have called like a kind of gray war between the United States and China, a gray war. This is more like a corporate competition, you know, jostling and poking and, you know, up and down, and it's not an all-out overt war, but it's influencing and shaping and things like that. So influence campaigns, you know, political influence on democracies is one of many policy tools that the United States and China and other countries all around the world deploy. They use these tools to influence the politics of other countries that matter, essentially. And the United States and China matter, and we're trying to influence one another. So it's a very neutral, you know, this is not an antagonistic panel. We all love to go to Asia, and we love Asian countries. And we're going to talk about that, how to avoid kind of stereotypes and things like that. But this is really meant to be an examination of a kind of type of instrument that's used in a gray war. Okay, so everyone's done hearing me. So I'm going to start out with Sarah Cook from Freedom House to kind of give us the big picture, and then over to Isaac on the big picture, and then I'll do a couple of questions following up, and then we'll turn it to the audience. Sarah, take it away.
So starting on Devin's point, I think when we're thinking about this topic generally, one of the real things to maybe both keep in mind and even thinking about how we articulate it is to disaggregate China and the Chinese Communist Party. And it's hard, especially when you're trying to write succinct headlines. But it really is different. And I think when you look at it, what's actually happening, especially the phenomena and the dynamics that are more aggressive and more intentional, it's Chinese Communist Party strategy. And even though the Chinese Communist Party rules China, and under Xi Jinping, the state and the party have become fused more than they had been previously, you know, there are lots of Chinese people and other people in China and outside of China that do not agree with the Chinese Communist Party or may not even be necessarily affiliated with the party. It's really very different when you see something that's very closely linked. Some people might have heard the term the United Front Work Department. That's actually a department of the Chinese Communist Party that does, you know, coordinate a lot of this type of influence campaign, not only in the media, which is what I'm going to talk about more, but there's lots of different ways in which the Chinese Communist Party tries to influence democracies. My particular area of expertise has to do with media and social media, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth at that. But it ranges from political donations to various other forms of trying to co-opt or influence key politicians. In some cases, indirectly, also like to political donations, other ways supporting certain candidates, influencing the diaspora. I'll talk about diaspora media. But there's a range of different strategies. And actually, if you look at the literature and the writings of the Communist Party and the United Front Work Department, they're super clear about, like, these are strategies. And I think sometimes I'll be looking at, you know, the phenomena, and then I'll go and I'll actually, like, read one of their documents, like, oh my gosh, they're basically doing what they said they were going to do. And so I think a lot of, particularly the things that I would say are, you know, the phenomena and the examples that are not so benign, that gear more towards what some analysts in Australia have said are not so much soft power, but are more coercive, corrupt, and covert. So I think things that either, depending on the country's laws, may be actually illegal, or in other cases, I think would just be very clearly problematic in terms of democratic values and institutions. A lot of that are things that are really coming directly from the Communist Party. I think then it gets murkier, because when you talk about China's political influence, there's other indirect aspects where it's not always entirely tied to the Chinese government. You can't always trace it back to the Communist Party. And there are just, in some cases, even just certain ways in which the way in which the Chinese government does business, even if it's, and does certain things and engages in certain things, and the ways Chinese companies are forced to, in a lot of ways, between a rock and a hard place to operate both inside China and abroad, ends up having an arguably negative influence on democracy and democratic norms outside of China, in a way that you might say would be maybe larger China influence. But again, I would say a lot of times, most of the source is really, it really comes back to the authoritarian government in Beijing. So in terms of thinking about, I guess, the media and informational space part, so I think a lot of you have seen the China Watch supplements in the news. If you go on Facebook, Chinese state media have tens of millions of followers on their Facebook pages. And if you actually look a little bit further down, you can kind of look a little closer, and you can actually look at where they're advertising to. They actually don't do that many Facebook ads in the United States. It's actually a lot to other developing countries. So if you go to CGTN France, and actually this is to Facebook's credit that it makes my work easier because they become more transparent about who's advertising to who. But you go to CGTN Française and you see that the ads promoting the page are actually really going to Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Now, if you look at the last, and I don't know if there's necessarily fully a correlation. I don't entirely understand what's been happening, why this is the case in Tunisia. But if you look at the last Pew survey about perceptions of China, including vis-a-vis the United States, Tunisia's like off the chart. They're like 66% are like, think China and Xi Jinping personally. They give them very good scores, I guess I would say. So I think there are other, I can talk a little bit later about, there are some academic studies that look at this more rigorously. But I think that that you see that those are examples that are really very clearly state media trying to push out and get into the narratives of other countries. And so from that perspective, I think two things I'll touch on and then I'll pause. One, so what does the Chinese Communist Party try to achieve with this? And two, what are the main ways in which they're actually going about trying to influence media and public debate in other countries? So the goals are very closely tied to the Chinese Communist Party's own priorities. They want to portray a benign China, a benign regime, a benign form of governance. They want to suppress critical coverage, and especially like investigative journalism and exposés. But some of the research that we had done, actually one of the things that was interesting was also incisive political commentary. So for example, in places like Taiwan, especially in the Chinese language media, that was one of the areas where it's really become tighter, particularly as certain media owners have been co-opted by the Chinese government and will manage the content of their stations or newspapers differently. It's the commentators who are being more critical of the Chinese government that start to lose their jobs. And then another aspect, I think, when you're looking at the global role that China has, is actually to make other countries be more open to Chinese investment and involvement and influence. And so that's another key goal. And that relates to also trying to suppress coverage of, say, environmental degradation or other problems that can come in some cases, corruption that emerge from the way that the Chinese government and state-owned enterprises and other companies may do business in other countries. And then I think a newer element that has emerged, particularly in the last 2 years, is this question of the China model. We used to, in the West, always talk about, well, there's a China model or other countries following the China model? Well, the Chinese government, they didn't really talk about it. And then at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping comes out and is like, yeah, we're going to be the model. And we're going to show other developing countries, to a way of governing. And, it's framed in this kind of CCP speak that sounds very innocuous. But it basically is how their governance system could work elsewhere. And so I think you do get a more proactive narrative of also trying to relay to people in other countries, and in some cases very practical with like the export of surveillance technologies and things like that, of transporting the China model to other countries. And for the media influence sphere, there are really, I would say, three main ways in which it plays out. One is this element of the propaganda side. The insinuating, especially Chinese state media content and narratives, even through other actors, into the media space. Some of it is direct. A lot of it's indirect, like by paid supplements, by other ways in which they actually have a term called borrowing the boat to reach the sea, where basically they're essentially inserting, because how many people are really going to go pick up a copy of the China Daily, right? But there are a lot more Americans, not only in America, it's in Australia, it's in the UK, it's in Kenya, it's in Argentina, it's in Peru, it's in Senegal, are picking up their newspaper, and there they see the China Watch supplement that doesn't it says it's an advertorial supplement, but not most times it doesn't. It might say it's from China. It definitely doesn't say that it's a state-owned newspaper. So that's one thing, is this element of kind of propagandizing and inserting the narrative. And that you could say, well, that's soft power, right? I mean, that we do, everybody does. I think the tricky thing is this lack of transparency, where it's not made clear what the origins are and the state motivations behind it. The second type is more problematic, which is the suppression of critical coverage. And that, I wrote a report called The Long Shadow of Chinese Censorship that has a pretty detailed analysis of all the different tools in the toolbox for this. But it ranges from various forms of direct action, like Chinese diplomats and embassy officials actually going to media owners, to journalists, to others outside of China and telling them, threatening them, intimidating them, actually cable company executives, that's happened in the United States, so that they wouldn't give a dissident Chinese TV station, get them on the air in the Washington, D.C. area. So those types of efforts that are really direct to try to pressure various people outside of China to change their coverage of China and their work on China. A second is the whole issue of economic carrots and sticks. And that's various means of co-opting and using particularly media owners who have business interests in China, either getting them to buy certain media outlets like happened in Taiwan, or suppress some of the coverage, critical coverage in the media outlets they already own. A third is working through proxies, so putting pressure on governments, satellite companies, and others, advertisers, in order to suppress critical coverage and make the financial sustainability of critical news outlets more difficult. And then the last is various forms of cyber attacks and physical attacks. Now, the last point I'll just make quickly is I think there's a new form in which the Chinese government and Communist Party and related companies are increasingly in a place where they can influence the narratives in democracies, and that relates to content management and delivery systems. So you have a situation where in many parts of Africa, a Chinese company that is privately owned but has received subsidies from the Chinese government and has clearly a close relationship called Star Times, has really overseen the transition from analog to digital television in multiple countries. And lo and behold, after a while, it comes out that, you know what? Their cheapest package now no longer includes BBC World. Their cheapest package now only includes CGTN, the Chinese state media, the international arm of the Chinese state media broadcaster, and local channels. And then you have other examples like this of, again, various ways in which key nodes in the information flow in other countries may be coming under control, and maybe they're not being activated now. But I think one of the challenges is to look at that arena and to see how they could be in the future, perhaps.
So Isaac, big picture.
Thank you. And Sarah, I think you made a lot of great points there, and I really like how you started with this idea of separating the party from China. The Communist Party loves to portray itself as China, and it loves to create this sense of inevitability over its rule and over, it loves to associate itself with China. It's certainly not, and when we talk and write and think about China, we should be as careful as we can to distinguish between the two. I also think it's very important to bring up that the United States has a terrible record of handling foreign threats without resorting to nativism, anti-immigration policies, racism, and in the case of Japanese during World War II, actual internment in concentration camps. And we are at a very fascinating, important, but also fragile time in the state of this country. And we, as citizens of America, need to figure out a way to counteract pernicious influence from Beijing, from the party, without allowing some of the horrors and tragedies that this country has seen in the past with immigrants and with intellectuals. We really don't want this to be another Red Scare. And I think it's worrying what you were talking about with Goldman Sachs and the global elites, and also this really nice Jewish coding there. Goldman Sachs, global elites, yeah, like cute band, and we get it. And we need to figure out a way to have this conversation to push back against people from companies like McKinsey and Goldman Sachs giving us the party line and clouding the democratic debate without going too far. And it's a really, really difficult challenge, and it's something that it's very important for us to work on. So I'd like to talk about two important ways that Beijing influences America. And I think it's useful to distinguish between how Beijing plays this game and how Moscow does. So Moscow, it's a lot more about chaos for chaos's sake. China, it's a lot more about China. It's a lot more about changing the way Americans think about and interact with China. On the one hand, you'd think, oh, that's less important. It's not about changing the way they do things in America. It's about changing the way they think about China. But it never just stays in the China field. It always bleeds into other aspects. And as part of the book I'm doing, I've been looking at various individuals and institutions and their relationships with China over the last couple decades. And it's fascinating to see how, sort of like that old cliche about Vegas, it just doesn't stay in that little field. It has really grand and, in some cases, quite worrying influences. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here about that, but I think a good way to think about what Beijing does is to distinguish it, to put it into two different categories. It's about amplifying positive voices and suppressing negative voices. So the amplifying positive voices is about finding Americans who can be encouraged or co-opted, or in some cases outright bought out, who are willing to express views that the party appreciates. And there's certain phrases that you hear being repeated a lot. I'm going to go into some of these phrases. It's important not to hear someone say one of these things and think, aha, spy. People, it's a very, very blurred line. There's a lot of gradations of this. But Beijing loves to describe itself as this a country that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That's a phrase that the party loves to say. And yes, it's true, but it's also this received wisdom that makes it feel like the party is the one that's responsible for the growth in China, as opposed to unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit of Chinese people. There's talk about win-win. There's talk about the camaraderie with Taiwan. There's talk about ethnic harmony. There's this knee-jerk response whenever someone brings up the concentration camps in Xinjiang in northwest China, where there's roughly 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. People will sometimes say, oh yeah, but America had slavery, or America did this, or America did that. Oh, and actually this is America's fault because of the global war on terror. Now, no one who you should be listening to denies that America has not committed a lot of really awful things, past, present, and unfortunately future. But just putting two things next to each other doesn't mean that they're equal. And just because America has committed crimes in the past doesn't mean that we shouldn't very forthrightly call out the abuses that we see in some parts of China today. So I lived in Beijing for about 6 years, and it was sort of interesting after I left to see the times when I was being groomed to be a friend of China, or a China hand, or an old Beijing is what they love to say. Just there's certain things that people will say to you, and you learn how to speak this kind of coded language where you say, oh yeah, China is developing very quickly, and yes, along with that development comes these problems like the pollution problem and the corruption problem and the traffic problem. And oh yeah, I guess we can mention Taiwan, but it's sensitive, but I'm actually speaking very, very openly because I'm actually talking about Taiwan. And so it changes the way that your brain works. It's actually, I don't want to use the phrase brainwashing, so I won't, but it gives you this model, this already built model that has been sanded over decades to how you should speak about China. And you have this sense of where these red lines are, and it doesn't actually allow you to have your own truth. And I think this is actually far more worrying and far more pernicious for Chinese Americans, some of whom have family in China, so are worried about that, some of whom face accusations of racism on both sides or of being traitors to their race. And one of the things that I would love to do with the research that I'm doing and the book that I'm doing is to give us and to give Chinese Americans their own ability to have a democratic debate about what we want to do about China's rise. So we are at a really important point in history. It could be that China soon becomes a country that has more ability to exert pressure internationally and domestically than America. And do we want to live in a world where China is the world's most powerful country? If not, can we do anything about it? And is what we would have to do worth the ethical sacrifices? These are really, really difficult questions. I don't have good answers to any of them, but what I think is really important is how do we, as a country, have this debate democratically so that we can decide, use the best information we can, and figure out what kind of world we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. So quick follow-up questions to both of you. Sarah, because we already addressed the other issues that we were thinking about talking about earlier, can you give us a sense of how effective these tools are in various regions? And also, if we are to do something about it, people always like to have a takeaway and have some recommendations. What would you recommend policymakers or even citizens to do?
Sure. So I think this plays out differently in different countries and regions, and even among different populations within a particular country. So Isaac mentioned the issue of the Chinese diaspora, and I think with regards to the Chinese diaspora, I think that the tricky thing about how do you not going in the direction where you're targeting members of the Chinese diaspora is that many of them are themselves victims of the pressures that the Chinese government is exerting, or of things like censorship. So for example, I don't know how many, here we'll go with Devin's approach. How many of you have heard of WeChat? That's pretty good. So WeChat is an instant messaging, doesn't really do justice to WeChat. It's a Chinese company's, it's an application by Tencent. And it's instant messaging, but it's also e-payments. It's like Facebook combined with WhatsApp, combined with like Google Pay, I guess, like all wrapped up together. And it's ubiquitous in China, particularly because there isn't really a long history of there isn't an established system for like credit cards and things like that. So from the payment perspective, it becomes very important. And so it's ubiquitous in China now, and this is a relatively new phenomenon. But censorship and surveillance on the platform are extremely intense and have intensified over the last 3 years in a way that I think previously had been a little bit hard to imagine. And I think what happens is that, I mean, I won't get into all the details of how Tencent, so they're really stuck between a rock. They are being forced basically by the Chinese government to censor and monitor people. I think the thing to keep in mind is that WeChat is increasingly being used by people outside of China. Hundreds of millions of people, especially members of the Chinese diaspora, but not only. It was actually in Mongolia the second most popular downloaded app in 2017. And that's a young democracy that you could see a situation where the Chinese government might have an interest in wanting to meddle in their elections a little bit by manipulating content on a popular social media application. What's happening is that we're seeing more and more evidence of WeChat monitoring for certain and censorship outside of China, including politically sensitive censorship. So for example, a politician in Canada published something trying to speak to the Chinese constituents to support pro-democracy umbrella protesters in Hong Kong. That message was deleted. In another case, when the arrest of the Huawei CFO happened in Canada, it was found that a lot of messages on WeChat group were being deleted. Local Chinese language media outlets in Canada were trying to report on this and have WeChat breaks up into lots of different kinds of accounts too. Have certain kinds of public accounts that allow them to push out content to followers. Weren't able to do it on that topic and had to do all these workarounds because they kept getting deleted. I wrote an article about this a couple of months ago, and I get an email from an Asian American activist, actually. He's not really an activist. He's like a community organizer. Critical of the Chinese government, but that's not really his focus. He lives in Massachusetts, and his focus is really on Asian American issues. And he wrote to me saying that he was censored and silenced on WeChat, including in groups with other Chinese Americans, talking about Chinese American issues. And that basically what happened is like he was sending messages to groups, I think, that he had even started. And people weren't seeing the messages. And then he was trying to go to the Facebook part of his account and post there, and his family in China weren't able to see it. And then he actually, at some point, I think completely got locked out of the account, or tried to open another account with one of his kids' phone numbers in America and got locked out of that account eventually because of the kind of content he was sharing. And like, this is just a snippet. And he actually said, this actually seems to have really intensified because he had a whole network of friends and people he knew that this had happened to relatively recently in the last 6 months or so. And so there are actually more and more examples of this coming in. We don't even have a clear picture. I really want to try to do a survey among him and some of his colleagues to kind of figure out what's going on. But I think you can see here both the way it really profoundly affects the kind of information that Chinese speakers in the diaspora can access. In Australia, it's the case as well. There have been studies of what was actually shared by Chinese language newspapers there, even Chinese versions of English newspapers about politics in China. And it was pretty much, it was like the party Congress, and there was nothing about politics, right? So I think you can see here a possibility where, now, is Tencent getting a directive from the Chinese Communist Party to do some of this kind of censorship? In some case, probably yes. We know that it was told about the Huawei situation not to do that. Certainly the umbrella, the umbrella movement. Were they told to do it outside of China? Well, maybe not, But there's definitely a situation where if it was decided that they wanted to even more either because this is just the way Tencent interprets the Chinese Communist Party's priorities that they need to implement because they want to keep their business license in China, or if it's like specific directives, the reality is that it really influences the space. Now, then you take a step back and say, well, first of all, Freedom House, you can't really open an account and publish the kind of stuff that we publish the China Media Bulletin in Chinese. I can't really start sharing that on WeChat to constituents in the United States. Dissident Chinese media here who cover issues like what's happening in Xinjiang, like the persecution of Falun Gong, they can't. Even regular other media that might have accounts, they're afraid that their account's going to get shut down by WeChat if they start sharing that kind of information. And if a very large percentage of whether it's Chinese Americans or other members of the diaspora, WeChat is a primary source of news for them, and are using it now to interact with politicians, that really creates a space for both where the inherent manipulation on WeChat is affecting conversations, and the space for more deliberate meddling becomes even starker. I think I would say that's just one example, I think, of how it plays out. And that happens in different parts of the world. Other ways in which the dynamics change, look, you have a situation in places, again, in places like Africa, the emphasis is really much more on propaganda than on the suppression of critical coverage, though it starts to emerge. Partly because you don't have Tibetan and Falun Gong activists in Africa, which you do in other countries, and they're often the primary target of the suppression. But when a columnist wrote a column about what was happening in Xinjiang for a South African newspaper that 5 years ago with a 20% stake was purchased by a Chinese company, his column got censored and his contract got discontinued. So you see some of these dynamics that have started in certain places and they pop up in others. Similarly, in places like Latin America, I think, again, it's a little bit of a softer dynamic. In places where the Chinese government feels more threatened by certain conversations or by certain actors, the efforts are much more deliberate and strategic, and I think actually end up violating freedom of expression, in ways that undermine democratic norms. So when you have dissident media that were started by Falun Gong practitioners that actually are kind of an alternative to some extent, to the pro-Beijing media, or even some Taiwanese stations. In some cases, the Chinese government has been very aggressive in trying to restrict their space. So they threatened an RCN executive to not put New Tang Dynasty TV on television. They go to the advertisers, and this isn't just the Falun Gong-related papers. It also comes up with other dissident or critical and independent Chinese media in places like Canada. Just a couple of weeks ago in Australia, a local Australian council got like repeated visits from the Chinese embassy until they finally canceled a Chinese New Year sponsorship partnership with an independent Chinese media in Australia. So I think that you have a situation where a Western politician basically sided with the Chinese government against an independent Chinese media outlet that actually played a really important role in helping inform some of the major media reports, that mainstream media reports that exposed the level of Chinese influence in Australia. So I think it's in those situations where we're thinking about, well, what do we do about this? I think one of the first things is we really have to find ways to uphold our values in our institutions. So that means enforcing transparency. So when Chinese state media are not registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and one of the main things the Foreign Agent Registration Act does is actually force transparency. And Chinese CCTV, the Chinese language version of state broadcaster, is not registered. China Daily is, and some other ones are. So that's, I think, for example, one thing. Another thing is to hold hearings or other efforts to make sure that WeChat, that Tencent, okay, I would rather they not censor and monitor Chinese people inside China, but they certainly should be pushed to uphold the First Amendment rights and the rights to privacy of people outside of China and democracies, and potentially suffer the consequences of lawsuits and fines and other regulatory consequences that you would expect pretty much any other social media company to experience. And then I think we should have a situation where we're looking at ways to support in various ways the alternative media that are critical along a various spectrum of the Chinese government. But I'm just, oh, sorry, I'm just going to pause. That was my last point, was we just find ways to support, these, whether it's funding, training, things like that, because, they're the media that really give an important window to our, our fellow Americans or others who are Chinese speaking. So.
One idea with this is we have a much more limited ability to change the way things work in China, and you can make a strong argument that that's not our place to do, but we do have far more of an ability to restrict the influence of individuals and apps that come here and work against our values. And there's a really difficult conversation about reciprocity, which we're starting to have. Because Beijing bans Facebook, does that mean that we should ban Chinese social media apps. Well, no, that doesn't seem like a good way of doing things. But what is a better way of doing things? And I think we are in a very strange time in that there is strong bipartisan support for a lot of what Trump is doing with regards to China, and a lot of, in my view, very deserved skepticism and disrespect for the man himself and a lot of his policies and for the way that he carries out those policies. So we have this groundswell of support for someone who doesn't really have bipartisan support in almost any other area. And part of our responsibility is to push back and not allow the Trumpian way of handling relationships with China to be the way that we do it.
I think I'll turn it over to the audience to get engaged. We have about half an hour left. And I guess the way we'll do it is people just come up to these two mics, like a town hall style, right? Who would like to go first? Maybe identify yourself too, please.
Yeah, I'm Colonel Chopra from the Indian Army, retired. Well, I have a good point for Sarah Cook. You mentioned about WeChat. Well, the Chinese are using it in a big way by the Ministry of Social Security. The Chinese intelligence knows that the West cannot monitor that. And that's the way they communicate. If we can do something about that, we can get them, you know. But we have no source of that. Second is that as Davos, they started the new conference 3 years back at Boa, Hainan province, where they invite the heads of states just to manipulate their minds. They give them the free business class ticket, $5,000 each, and they manipulate the minds. So that is something which you have missed out totally. And the third point is that as far as Canada is concerned, the entire Canadian penetration is by the Chinese intelligence. The Operation Sidewinder is top secret. Every single sphere of Canadian has been influenced by Chinese. There are more than 25,000 Chinese spies all over. And
I think so. Just to jump in on your question there. So this is a conference that is held in a resort island, and it's sort of like Davos. It gets a wide participation from elites, I'll use the word, but from elites and heads of state around the world. And the issue is not that Beijing is hosting this major conference and bringing people together. The issue is that we have a lot of skepticism about Beijing's intentions, and there's a lot of issues with transparency about how Beijing and the party operates. So there's a lot of other countries that do similar types of influence operations. I mean, we're actually living one right now, and Taiwanese are supporting this panel, and we're here saying messages that they want to be amplified. You know, we tend to agree somewhat, I think, with a lot of those messages, but it's not that Beijing is hosting this conference, it's that we have a lot of worries about the situation in Xinjiang and the situation among, you know, with China's influence in America and the party's grip on power. So I think we want to try to disaggregate those.
if you notice the museum that made, the South China Sea Museum, they make sure that every delegate who's of some consequence is taken there, and they show that in the past 2,000 years, this South China Sea belongs to China. They made those barges, they made all the stuff, which they probably manipulated.
I'll just make a quick response to that, and then I also definitely want to see what he has to say. But in Chinese, the phrase South China Sea, they don't call it South China Sea, they call it the South Sea, Nahai. East China Sea is not East China Sea, it's Donghai, it's East Sea. And so we are doing some of the lifting for them. By calling it the South China Sea, we are making people think that it belongs to China when it doesn't. It's similar to how we refer to Xi Jinping in English. So we call him president. China doesn't have a president. That's fine. You don't have to have a president. We don't have a prime minister. But they have the three titles that Xi holds. Two are chairman. One is general secretary of the Communist Party. But it's mistranslated into English to give this democratic veneer. And that is something that we also have to get rid of from our lexicon.
And then my last point is that the United Front, as you mentioned, is the strong arm of the intelligence organization. And that is totally handled directly by the CCP itself. And when they call you friends of China or honorable friends of China, means that it's just a job description. You have to align by what China wants you to do. It's not a title or an honor in any sense.
Thank you.
Just to your point, I think about WeChat. I mean, I don't know as much about in terms of, do Chinese security services use it? So because they feel like the West can't monitor it, I'm not sure. But what is certain is that WeChat is monitoring the conversation. It gives them a insight into the communications of people who are using it outside of China. And we know they also use it to intimidate people and collect information. We know that particularly in the case of the Uyghurs. There was just a couple of weeks ago a hacker who came up across, again, all these like leaked databases that have like no security of WeChat. It was one day of messages. There were like 37 billion messages that had been flagged because of certain sensitive triggered keywords. 19 million of them were in English outside of China. And these were basically monitored and captured. They weren't necessarily censored. They were captured for review. And the list, you know, it's South Korea. There might have been India. There was certainly Australia, the United States. And so you have a situation where just from a surveillance perspective and kind of national security, if you're certain people who are writing about certain things, you probably don't want to be using WeChat. And we have seen some countries like Australia, I think like India, who have required, say, members of the military and others who hold sensitive government jobs not to be allowed to have WeChat, say, on the phones that they use for that kind of communication.
Hi, my name is Kevin McMullen. I'd like to know how this problem fits in to the whole global strategy of the new Cold War. The Navy War College makes a big deal about practicing an economy of enemies, and that doesn't mean just during wartime. So, should we have a true rapprochement, for example, with Russia and Iran? Should we treat the president of the Philippines the way we used to treat Trujillo in the Dominican Republic? And the famous phrase, I think, was, he's an SOB, but at least he's our SOB. And I was present in this room when everybody but myself had a seizure because a speaker ended by saying the United States has no national security interest in promoting women's rights in the third world. Now, how do we fit this problem with China into the other issues in the world when we know that other countries are going to want a quid pro quo for cooperation?
Low-hanging fruit with that is to not alienate our allies in Europe and Asia and Australia. And that's another thing that I think a lot of people are pushing back on with Trump's strategy. I would say, though, I don't think the new Cold War is the right way to describe it. And I think as a nation, we're grasping around for the right term. One of the problems with the Cold War designation is that we were actually almost allied with China during the Cold War against the Soviet Union, so that is confusing. But it's also, we're so much deeper integrated with the Chinese than we are with the Soviets. So if anyone does come up with a really good term, let me know, and I would like to borrow it.
But should we perhaps try to bail out countries like Sri Lanka and Greece when they're subject to economic exploitation by China and as a result turn over their port facilities?
I think it's much easier to just not alienate Western Europe, Canada, and Japan, and a lot cheaper than to spend billions of dollars bailing out Sri Lanka or countries like that.
I mean,
we have 2 lines here, so we make it a little shorter.
I would just say, I think in this case, initially at least, the best offense is like a defense, because I think they're already so far ahead of us. If what we can do is actually set up better institutions, rules, regulations to protect against the, I would say, the undemocratic or the kind of more problematic forms of influence, both for ourselves, but also to set an example. I mean, if you look at certain types of laws, like CFIUS, for example, in the United States, that's a committee that looks at foreign investment. That other countries are looking at that as an example because that actually has helped protect certain key sectors in the United States from, not only from Chinese, but from other types of influence and investment that could be problematic. So I don't think that the answer is only, say, for the US to do a good job, but I think just in general, for democracies or for some of the other countries to really look at protecting. First, let's try to see how we protect our systems better. And I don't think from that perspective it's necessary to be, and to share information and awareness about how this works and the tactics and what works to push back. I think that would at least be a first stage and would get us further than where we are now.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Zan. I work for an NGO supporting youth around the world. And yeah, I just wanted to bring the sort of democracy back into the focus and ask, particularly in the developing world, what your thoughts are, because from what I know, China is engaging in trade and aid, and also potentially censorship and nefarious activities in democracies and autocracies across the developing world. And for all the sort of activity you've mentioned, it strikes me as more self-promotion and self-interest for China, as opposed to actively trying to dismantle democracy, as it were. From the evidence you've seen, do you think China, is it more focused on self-interest, or are they actively hostile to democracy and trying to destroy that?
I think it is. I think it's the former. I think it is much more about China's interest than about trying to dismantle democracy. And I think it's very difficult, and I think somewhat inappropriate for us to say, oh, China shouldn't invest billions of dollars in Cambodia or in Tajikistan or in other desperately poor countries around the world that really do need the aid or really could use the aid. And so it's a difficult one to decide, okay, these are the cases which we should stand up and push on. But I think also, getting a little bit to your question and the last point just made, I don't think there should be a battle between democracies and non-democracies. Just with the numbers, we don't do nearly as well than if it's about the American model and the China model. And this is another thing that's so unfortunate about the timing of this, because in China and in countries around the world, America was really this beacon of freedom. And I hate to use was, and maybe it sort of was, is maybe kind of a soft was. But with the election of Trump, we have much less soft power politically than we used to be, than we used to have. And 2016, 2015, we would always win an ideological war with China. And now it's a lot more blurry. And it'll really depend a lot on what happens in 2020. But don't mean to be cliche here, but this really does start at home. And if we are able to improve our image by improving our domestic politics, it's going to be a lot easier to tell countries around the world, hey, our model is very attractive.
So I actually would maybe differ with Isaac a bit on that, though I definitely agree. I think it's certainly more the former than the latter. I think the tricky thing is that by its nature, the way the Chinese Communist Party operates and governs China is anathema to democracy. Like, it just, and then the way they go out and do business in other places and try to impose and achieve the goals they're trying to achieve for their own self-interest ends up having potentially negative consequences on democratic institutions. You see that with regards to corruption questions, and certainly non-transparency and the general opacity that involves a lot of dealings. I mean, in the example that I gave earlier of Star Times, besides the issue of, which channels more people have access to or not, in Zambia, there have been some real concerns about how Star Times ended up with a joint venture with the main broadcaster, because there are questions of they really shouldn't have been able to do that, because usually there are kind of, like anti-competitive laws, like basically like to protect open competition, so that a company that's delivering the content shouldn't be a content provider itself. And in general, what you see in terms of the aid, for example, that China gives to media sectors in different parts of the developing world, it tends to heavily favor the local state-run media. And so I think that's one example where it's favoring them at the expense of the independent or more less local media that are not as heavily state-controlled. Now, in some cases, that might be happening in democracy. In other cases, I think it's in what we would call Freedom House, the partly free countries, where there's really a battle going on. And I think that's where it's not even so much always consciously, is this the China model? Maybe for certain elites, the China model or the American model. Or, I mean, I think there's so many democracies around the world that, like, for example, on Freedom House's indices, perform much better than the United States. It would be much better to have democracy be the Swedish model, or even the Taiwanese model. Taiwan actually does better than the United States on our democracy index right now. That I think when people are, it's these day-to-day battles of in which direction is the policy making, or the economic clout and quid pro quo, in what direction is it pulling? And I think what's happening in the developing world is also that, and not only is that China and the Chinese Communist Party, they're developing this economic clout that should, and this access to the information nodes in the information floor, that should they wish to do something more Moscow-like and meddle and cause chaos more aggressively, they're very well positioned to do so. And we've seen some tinkering with that in Taiwan with regards to fake news and now trying to maybe buy up some popular Facebook pages and things like that. I think they have a special interest in Taiwan to undermine the current government. But I think it might, we haven't quite seen how this plays out. And I think the concern is that as they gain that kind of leverage, it's really almost in a question of when they're going to try to activate it when the Communist Party sees something that's in their particular interest, as opposed to if they're going to do it.
Norway has a stronger democracy than the US, and I think 3 years ago they denied the Dalai Lama a visa because they didn't want to offend Beijing. So I think for this battle or gray war, whatever we're getting into, it's less about the strength of the democracy, but the ability to stand up to Beijing.
Yeah. And that the US is in a uniquely positioned for sure.
So we have about 6 questions remaining and about 10 minutes left here. So let's do like a little rapid round here for the rest. So bang, bang. So Chris goes first, and then we'll take 2 questions at a time.
So my name's Chris. I really appreciated both of your comments. I hear you both as people who are looking to encourage criticism of China where it might be appropriate, but you're trying to sort of moderate how far that could go. And I think the point that Isaac is underlining here about the context of the Trump administration is so important. It's one that I'm really frustrated hasn't been highlighted more in these kind of discussions over the last couple of years. So to try to make it a little bit more concrete, I'm wondering if there's any thoughts you can share about whether you think invoking the Holocaust is appropriate in discussing what's going on in Xinjiang, or if you think that's something that pushes us too far in a direction that we don't want to go. Big picture. Thanks.
Yeah, Albert Goldstein, Geopolitical Risk. Could you talk about the long game? There are thousands of young Chinese coming of age that have gone to American, Canadian, and European universities, have lived here anywhere from 4 to 7 years. There are thousands of them. They go back to China. To what extent they will be the new leadership of China, let's say within 20, 25 years? To what extent will that improve American-Chinese relationships? I'm not looking for them to convert China to a democracy. Rather, they would probably stay communist, autocratic. To what extent will that improve relations between China and the U.S. as far as just cooperation on quite a number of issues?
I think I'll try to briefly combine the 2 answers, but Adolf Hitler went to a Western university, and there's nothing naturally liberalizing about studying in America. I mean, people would ask me that question a lot when Kim Jongun took power because he spent time in Switzerland. There's a lot of awful people who've spent a lot of time. There's a lot of awful people from Switzerland. It's not a uniquely North Korean thing. For the Holocaust question, I think it's really important that you bring that up. I think it depends on what you're using that information for. So about 7 years ago, there was a major scandal with Bloomberg News where they killed a story critical to high levels of the party. And Matthew Winkler, the editor-in-chief at the time, compared the situation in Beijing to Nazi Germany in the 30s and said, as a result, they had to pull the story. This is problematic for 2 reasons. One, I was in Beijing at the time. That was certainly not the climate. You're allowed to have whatever opinion you want, but that was an inaccurate reading of the situation. Second is that if it's as bad as Nazi Germany in the 30s, why are you there in the first place? Why are you listening to the Nazi government telling you what to do? So I think when it comes to, I think there's China and then there's Xinjiang with this. The situation in Xinjiang is absolutely atrocious. It might be a lot worse than we think. It's very difficult to get that information out. And I think it's useful because we don't want to stay silent for this. And I think as we navigate how we manage our relationship with China, we don't want to think, oh gosh, if I make this comparison, I might not get a visa, or I might have a harm in this business deal or I'm trying to do, or I might be less influential. And I think we just want to be able to say what we believe. We're not always going to be right, but we're not doing this so that we're pleasing Beijing. We're doing this because we want to share our opinions and we want to exert change and exert influence and have these conversations. So I think the more we talk about it, the better.
I mean, I would say on that question, I think it's one of these situations where certainly I think looking at it as a pre-genocidal situation, and again, as Isaac said, we're not really sure exactly the scale of the deaths, for example. One of the other areas I've done a lot of research on is actually the persecution against people who practice Falun Gong in China. And that's been going on for 20 years. And an article I recently wrote actually found that 4 officials that are playing a key role in what's happening in Xinjiang have basically been running these same kind of transformation campaigns against people who practice Falun Gong in other parts of China. And one of the findings from a report we did on religion in China was that there is very credible evidence that people have, prisoners of conscience, have been killed for their organs to be used in organ transplants. And it's a really complicated technical explanation, and I'm happy afterwards to explain why I think that this is the case. And I think when you look at what's happening in Xinjiang on that background and some of the circumstances, it's really scary. It's really scary because they've got the massive biodata. Basically what they do in China is they reverse match organ transplants. People get transplants within a week, within a month. They reverse match them to people in custody or who they otherwise have access to. And those can be, I think it breaks down across a variety of different populations. So I think, I think from that perspective, it's maybe a genocide, it's maybe pre-genocidal. I think the tricky thing with the Holocaust, being like an Israeli Jew myself, is that, you know, it's tricky because right now there aren't, thank goodness, 6 million Uyghurs that have been killed in Xinjiang, as far as we know. There are 2 million in concentration camps. So I think looking actually at Germany in the 1930s is an interesting parallel, or even a little later than that, because you're looking at why are you pulling all these people indefinitely into concentration camps, and what are the risks that they are facing, and at what point does it turn into genocide? And so I think that's a really important question we need to be looking at and thinking about. But I think even more than that is what do we do about it? And I think that's where sanctioning some of the officials involved, both the big names like Chen Quanguo, but some of the other people, it really hits Chinese officials in the pocketbook. They're really afraid of it. That's probably why they're trying to get the Trump administration, the trade war and stuff like that, to not do it. But they really are afraid of it. And it can really make a difference all the way down the chain of command. One of the things we found when we were doing research was that actually even Xi's anti-corruption campaign, because he had purged some of the big tigers who were really involved in some of the, like they were leading the security services. When activists from overseas call local police and try to convince them not to persecute people, like, look, nobody protected Zhou Yongkang. Who's going to protect you? And you know, so these types of situations, there is some wiggle room among local officials. They're all making their own cost-benefit analyses. And the more we can push them in the cost side so that they don't participate in really life and death situations for Chinese people, whether they're Uyghur or Tibetan or Falun Gong or other Han Chinese or Christians, is really an important role and tool that we have in our hands right now.
2 more.
I'm Jigger, and the question I have was about Chinese media and influence operations abroad. So my question was, what can the U.S. do to compete with China for influence abroad in this sphere? Do you think Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, institutions like that have a role, or do you think they are more suited for the 20th century and that the United States needs a new approach? And if so, what would that approach look like?
Answer is a little shorter because we have about 5 minutes left. Yeah.
Hi, Ed Albrecht from Mercy College. The picture that I'm getting here is that an increasingly effective use of soft power by China should be counteracted with softer soft power on our side, where we appeal to values, democracy, and other abstract principles. I'm afraid that that might, in a way, be a kind of the swan song of a dying West, where we just complain that values are not being respected, but in the meantime, we just lose more and more power. And might not that be dangerous in the sense that it makes the realpolitik argument to combat with more realistic terms more appealing to people?
That's a great question. Yours is easier, so maybe I'll start with that one. I think the gosh, now I'm just having a senior moment. What is oh, right. So I think it sort of reminds me of Made in China 2025, which people have been freaking out about. And I still do believe that a lot of the successes of the Chinese party state over the last couple decades were despite the party, as opposed to because of the party. So the Chinese tech companies that we've heard of are all private companies. Huawei is confusing and unique, and who really knows who owns Huawei? But Alibaba, Tencent, they all have deep relationships with the state, but they were private individuals who wanted to make money and build something. And I think we do much better to compete with Chinese media globally with the New York Times and the Washington Post and Reuters and AP and outlets like that, as opposed to Radio Free Asia and VOA, which do some good reporting, but have so little influence compared to how much money is spent on them. And I think the success of outlets like China Daily and CGTN, for them, it's less about how people are actually watching them, but it's more sort of background noise that populates people's thoughts. And it's a way that, it's sort of a template for people who want to be soft on these issues to speak. It's a lexicon for people who want to be beholden. Do you want to jump in and then I can.
Sure. So
briefly
I
touch
think
this?
just to clarify, I think my point isn't necessarily in the level of values. I think it's about institutions, which I think is different. I think if you're saying we're going to investigate WeChat and look at them and say, or have people file lawsuits, and look and say, look, you're operating in the United States. You cannot go and just delete a whole conversation by Chinese Americans about, Asian American political issues. You just can't do that. I think that's about really upholding and if you're saying, look, we're going to have standards of transparency that require you to, either codes of conduct like Google actually does on YouTube right now, that CGTN is funded by the Chinese government. It does write that Radio Free Asia is funded by the U.S. government, but that's okay, I think. So I think it's more about that. I think it's about the institutions and how do you strengthen the institutions and find the right legal and regulatory, as well as I think other elements that are maybe more public awareness, which maybe is softer, but I think supporting civil society, informing journalists, supporting journalists, Chinese independent outlets or others who are facing cyber attacks regularly, providing them funding and expertise to push back against that so they can actually get their message out to the local Chinese community, because they can speak it much better than I can. They have a right to have those debates. So I think it's really in those areas, honing in on what are the institutions and the rules to strengthen that aspect in a very practical way, as opposed to necessarily, just talking about democracy and values, which is also very important. But I think we really have to figure out where the rubber hits the road and figure out how to do that well.
Let's take this last question. I think this is the last one, and then I was thinking maybe you could kind of synthesize all the little bits that are remaining. Solve all the problems.
My name is Evan Kornblue, and just again on this question of propaganda, I'm curious if you guys or anyone in this space has looked at all at the role of digital literacy and sort of and the impact of this. I know there's been some interesting coverage in the U.S. recently of how maybe older Facebook users, for example, are newer to the platform, less well equipped to distinguish between different types of misinformation. And have you seen any of sort of that in terms of the relative influence of the propaganda in some of these other countries, or in how we might do types of training and education to counteract it?
I haven't seen studies of that, but I think some of our friends in Taiwan could probably speak more, because Taiwan's actually quite advanced in looking at issues of digital literacy and how to have people learn how to maybe identify fake news, including from China and elsewhere. But I do think in general, especially having just really dipped into the Facebook ads that the Chinese state media use, I think they're really trying to tap into not just the developing world, but I think this newer generation of Facebook users. And there's also some really quirky stuff. So People's Daily, which is the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece. I'll end with this little anecdote, okay? On Facebook, they've got tens of millions of users, and I'm like, who's following People's Daily? It's if you look at the Chinese version, it's the most staged Xi Jinping on every page, on the front page. So I go to their Facebook page. Well, of course, it's panda videos, but it's all these other random things. A grandma climbing out of the 30th store building and getting down. Don't worry, Granny's okay. And when you look actually at what's happening in different countries, you look at social bakers, because I happen to be looking through at a few different countries in Southeast Asia. In Indonesia, this is what got me looking at this. In Indonesia, People's Daily is the 7th most followed. There are 4 million people from Indonesia following People's Daily on Facebook. It's the 7th most followed Facebook page, media page in Indonesia. So, okay, so then what's People's Daily doing, right? So first of all, okay, is that content harmful? No, it does fit into, I would say, the sphere of China's benign and it's all pandas and grannies who can climb down from this 30th story. But I think it is also fits with what Isaac is saying, which is, I think the other thing is that I think it is building a channel. Because then if suddenly there's some kind of confrontation, some big Chinese deal they want to get in Indonesia, suddenly they can very quickly switch over to providing content that serves their interests more directly and is maybe more directly, I would say, on the level maybe propaganda, politicized propaganda, or even disinformation. So I think that that's kind of an example of how things are playing out, maybe in the social media sphere, especially among populations who maybe just don't know what people's daily is. And if you look at all these state media on Facebook, they're very deceptive in their taglines. They just say, oh, the biggest newspaper in China. They don't say the Communist Party's mouthpiece. CGTN is just 24-hour news from China. It's not state-owned 24-hour news. Like if you go through one at a time, it's really quite deceptive the way they're self-promoting.
So I'd like to end in a response to your question. Among the many hilarious things that Thomas Friedman has said over his career was, yeah, just to end with one, was that he went to a conference, a World Economic Forum conference in Northeast China, and they were able to put the building together in several months. And my subway in Bethesda has been, the elevator has been broken for 6 months, and therefore China is so much more advanced and they're eating our lunch. And you just wish that he had entered into a Chinese apartment building or seen, there's thousands of counterexamples of really falling apart Chinese infrastructure. And that's not to say that China is bad or America is bad or China is good or America is good. It's that the more people actually go and spend time in China outside of these packaged tours that the party and the government and businesses put on for foreign dignitaries and foreign students, the more they see that it's a place that in some ways is really taped together at the seams. And it's not, I'm not saying that to say that, oh yeah, the party is going to fall apart any day now, because who knows? You really go broke predicting on that. But I think the real issue is that the more that Americans and other people around the world actually go and spend time in China and talk to Chinese people and learn the language, the smarter our policies will be, the more effective we will be at countering pernicious Chinese influence, and the more we'll learn about the country that, for good or for bad, is going to be our most important foreign relationship.
Excellent. But I heard that Tom Friedman talked to a taxi cab driver.
Oh my God, that's,
yeah, he did.
Wow, that's a scoop. That's
heard.
great.
Isaac and Sarah, thank you so much. Thanks to Tico. Thank you all. Also, we have a program called Information Warfare on our website. There's more than 35 episodes of podcasts. Check it out.